Welcome back. We are. Here we go. Apologies, these stalls are a little bit precarious. So thank you very much. Now, I think there are people on the aisles. If you've got a question card, then wave it around and someone will take it from you. Thank you. Thank you very much already to the many of you who've sent in texts already. You still can, but I can tell you from straight off, we're not going to be able to cover them all. But for those questions that you still have as you go away this evening, please do speak to one of us about it before you go. Okay? I want to take this question first here. And I'm going to put this one straight to you, Chris, sitting next to me here. This is in reference to something we read in Matthew 28 about some people doubting when they saw Jesus, according to Matthew's account. Why do you think some people still doubted despite seeing evidence of Jesus raised from the dead right in front of them?
Well, I think this relates to something of the psychology of belief in a way, which is that actually the evidence has to be interpreted. Whatever the evidence is that we see, it has to be interpreted. There's a human dimension to knowledge. And so whether we want to believe reflects not only what our rational mind can comprehend, but what our will is saying. And if we don't want to believe something, then actually it doesn't really matter. Jesus himself would say this. It doesn't really matter how great the evidence is. If we don't want to believe, we can leave here tonight not believing, because the will is involved. And that's why, when I was showing about, I'll come back to Matthew in a moment, but when I was showing about the empty tomb, actually it is not that controversial to talk about the empty tomb in terms of New Testament theology, history and scholarship. But what explains the empty tomb? That's the controversy. Can you refer to a divine miracle, that God raised someone from the dead? Well, that's where, of course, the skeptical historian who may accept an empty tomb will look for any and every explanation, or even say, we just don't know, rather than accept the conclusion that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. And that's because the will is involved. And so we can go even further in the Matthew example and show, well, some of you here may be saying, well, look, we've supplied evidence, but a lot of the evidence we've been supplying is historical and literary. What we want is the writing in the sky. And then you'll leave here a little bit later. Who knows? Maybe there'll be writing in the sky. It might say up there, David, you must believe. But then you'll say, unless your name's not David, but if your name is David, that wouldn't work. But if your name's David, you say, yeah, but that's just the cloud formation. And then something else may happen that's even more. Jesus said, even if you see someone raised from the dead, if you don't want to believe, you can resist that and choose not to believe. And I think that's really what it's getting at. There's a human dimension to believing, and that's why we can't force anybody to believe. And I love that fact about the evidence. The evidence is there. The evidence is compelling. C.S. Lewis would say that he was the most reluctant convert in all Christendom because he felt the evidence was so overwhelming. He was reluctantly converted in that sense. But the reality is we can't force anyone to believe. And if you choose not to believe, well, that is your choice.
Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. Either of you want to comment on that one at all before we go to another one? John, here's one that was specifically, it's got your name on it, specifically. It's about collusion. It says, to John, the named witnesses were close to Jesus. Are there enough accounts from those who were against him to make a compelling argument against the idea of collusion?
Well, first of all, dealing with the collusion point and those close to him, even with people who are close to each other, it's very often if they conspire with each other, at least one of them, eventually, when faced with a great deal of difficulty and problem, will turn because they want to save their own skin. That simply is a fact of life. So I think you can't simply discount those that were close to him to start with in terms of saying, oh, well, they must simply have colluded with each other. Because I think we would have heard at least one of them, when you bear in mind what they then faced as they went on with their preaching and teaching and talking about Jesus. I think at least one or more of them would have turned around and said, you know what, this is just a pack of lies, it never happened, all the others are just spinning a yarn to you. And the simple fact is they didn't. Clearly, as far as the records relating to the other wider groups are concerned, I recognise that what the Bible tells us about them is a bit more sparse, if I may put it that way. I mean, Chris referred to Paul's letter in Corinthians, which he's the one who refers to the group of over 500 people witnessing Jesus and seeing him alive. And I grant you that as far as the Bible is concerned, we're not told any more about them. So I recognise, that is a valid question to ask about them. But again, even if somebody's only heard something once or seen something once, or it's said that they have, the chances are that if they think it is just a conspiracy, that sort of number, you're going to get people coming out and saying this simply isn't right. I didn't see Jesus, or this is just them telling you a story about it. So I think, it's a valid question to ask, was there a conspiracy or was there collusion? But the simple fact that nobody broke ranks, as they say, is very good, strong evidence. Certainly, if I was hearing a case, and I suspect most of my colleagues, if we were hearing cases where that was the factual situation, we would be persuaded by the evidence that they were giving.
Thank you, John. That's really helpful. This is a question in response to a point that you raised, actually, Chris. I'm going to put this to you, Emily, about people spending all of their time in these documents, but still not believing in what they claim to describe. It says, if the atheist theologians are studying the same convincing documents, but they're still atheists, is this evidence itself that that evidence is perhaps not as convincing as we're claiming this evening?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think Chris has actually answered it in some way with his previous answer. But I think also, I guess there's different motives we have, don't we, when we come to things. And I think the uncomfortable thing about investigating something like Jesus and his resurrection and who he was is that it's not kind of neutral. I mean, there's other controversies about historical things where the conclusion, maybe it would mean that you were more highly regarded in certain academic circles if you were right, but it wouldn't necessarily have much of an impact on your life. Whereas the outcome of this, the stakes are so high, and it's uncomfortable that God might actually be real and actually have something to say about our lives, and we might actually face him one day. And I think that may be part of the reason that we don't come to this neutral. Nobody comes to looking at Jesus and the Christian faith just from a completely objective perspective. We all have desires, we all have fears, we all have hopes about God, and we bring those with us. And I think that's probably true of the best scholars as well as us normal people.
Another normal person here, I trust. Emily, thank you. That's really helpful. I do just want to come to you again on that, Chris, that same question. Only because you spend time alongside people who are coming to the opposite conclusion, if you like, to you are, with the same evidence in front of them. How do you explain that? How does that not cut away the conviction that you have about the conclusions you're drawing from the same evidence?
I think Emily's put a finger on the fact that there are fashions as well. And this business of not being neutral, there are kind of fashions. This isn't just true of theology, actually. In science, as well as the humanities, there may be a kind of mainstream fashionable point of view to take, and sometimes you have to be able to go against the grain sometimes, because people aren't necessarily believing certain things because they're absolutely convinced of the evidence. They're believing it because that's the fashion of the scholarly department that they're in. I mean, it's interesting, if you look up and down the country, different universities will have departments that tend to have different kind of biases as a department, that's intriguing psychologically. Why would a department have a bias in a certain direction? So, for example, in terms of the Old Testament, there's a minimalist school of archaeology that believes the Old Testament has very little relevance to archaeology. And it's particular departments that have this kind of bias. Well, that's a real indication there are fashions going on here, and that this is not neutral. So I think going back to your point there about what we do with this, I think the question tonight is really useful, because when we're talking about the resurrection, there's lots of kind of surrounding things that we don't necessarily have to tackle first and foremost. The first and foremost issue, I think, is the empty tomb. are the Gospels providing us with a reliable historical tradition showing an empty tomb? And that's something I think we can demonstrate to our most sceptical friends. And even an atheist professor may sit down and say, well, do you know what, actually, it really does look like that. I mean, there's a Jewish scholar who believed, he died a few years ago, a Jewish scholar who believes in the resurrection of Jesus. He's not a Christian, Pinchas Lapid. Jewish scholar, but he believes the evidence is there for the resurrection of Jesus. He remained, as far as I know, a Jew until he died. He didn't become a Christian. But he saw that the evidence was there. And so, in other words, there's evidence, but what we do with that evidence, that's where the issue of neutrality comes in. People aren't neutral. And the thing is, Mike, actually, if it's true, we have to change our lives. We have to change our lifestyles. And that actually has an existential challenge to us. And for many people, they'd rather live the lives they want to live, for whatever reason that may be, than to go where this evidence would otherwise lead them. So I think all those issues of neutrality and fashions and so on are really important here. But the basic core evidence, that's, I think, something that we can discuss with even a sceptical friend.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Here's a question which I'm going to bring to two of you. I'm going to come to you, John, first, and then back to you, Chris, and Emily, you can input as well. I think this is one on a number of people's minds as I've discussed things with them over the years. Why did it take so long for accounts, I mean there's an assumption here which you may want to deal with as well, but why did it take so long for accounts of the life and death of Jesus to be written down? If a case using evidence recorded 40 plus years after the event were to be put in a modern day court, it's unlikely that it could be relied upon, even if it were recorded by supposed eyewitnesses. John, do you want to start?
I'll let Chris comment specifically on the factual side of how long it took to get written down, but my recollection from my very brief knowledge of it is that it wasn't that long after the earliest manuscripts that are available, parts of manuscripts of the Bible, don't date very far after the times they're talking about. Dealing with the question though specifically, I think it was about would a court accept documents written 40 years after the event? It would depend upon, literally, the evidence about them and how authentic the court considered those documents to be. Just because they're 40 years after the event doesn't automatically mean they should be disregarded and considered not to be authentic. They can be accepted if there's evidence to show how they came into existence and on what they are based. And clearly, as far as the Bible accounts are concerned in the Gospels and elsewhere, the accounts are very clear of the eyewitness accounts of what they saw and what they heard as far as Jesus was concerned. And so I don't think simply because they were written down, and I suppose the other point about that is that it's likely that they were written down at the time, I would think. It's just that the earliest manuscripts haven't survived. But there are a significant number of manuscripts, very early manuscripts of the Bible, that are fully accepted as being authentic in the general world. So I think they can be accepted as authentic, is my view on that.
Chris, sure.
Okay, so I don't know how long I can go on this one, but obviously there's a to put it briefly, there's no New Testament teacher or department that would suggest the Gospels kind of came down suddenly, all complete as they were at a certain point. In other words, everyone knows there's some kind of history behind them and their development, and this is not, again, it's not controversial. So wherever we date the Gospels, and I agree with John, they actually have much earlier dating, I think, than some more sceptical folk might say, but wherever we date the Gospels, that's not where it all begins. Even the literary form doesn't begin with the Gospels. So let me put it this way. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John generally are going to be dated somewhere from the 60s to the 90s. I think the 90s is too late. I go actually with a very liberal theologian called John A.T. Robertson, who didn't really believe in God in any personal sense, but as a New Testament theologian, John A.T. Robertson suggested the latest cut-off date for the writing of the New Testament Gospels is around 70 AD. And the reason why 70 is a really important date, 70 is the destruction of Jerusalem under the Romans, and everything changes after 70 AD. Judaism changes after 70 AD. We have rabbinical Judaism rather than the Pharisaical Judaism before 70. So 70 is a crucial date, and John A.T. Robertson argues the Gospels all reflect this pre-70s period. So that would give you the late date, 70. The resurrection of Jesus, death and resurrection of Jesus is around 30 AD. So that's the kind of time frame we're talking about. Mark is generally considered the earliest. You don't have to go with that, but generally. And so we can get within 20 to 30 years for it to be in the form of Mark. But, as I say, no New Testament department says they begin at that point. They're all drawing upon earlier sources. And there are two I just mentioned. And this is quite ironic, actually. New Testament departments talk about a source. They call it Q. It's just the first letter of a German word for source. I can't pronounce the German properly, so I won't embarrass myself. But it is source material. And what that material means is it's very clear. I mean, this is one way of putting it. There are other ways of doing it. But it's very clear that Matthew and Luke had use of Mark. But they also had use of other material that Matthew and Luke were both using that's not in Mark. And they also had independent material. Matthew had and Luke that are not in Mark and not in this other Q source. Now, there are other ways of constructing this, but if you just go with that date of around 60 to, let's go with 90, let's go with the late date, 60 to 90 for the Gospels, the source material must be much earlier still for them to be using it. So if you're going to put the source material earlier than 60, now you're getting back to within, 20 years, 10 years? And then it gets better than that. There's a second thing. And that is the New Testament has material earlier than the Gospels. The Gospels aren't the earliest material. I mentioned 1 Corinthians 15, which, as I say, scholars will date to the 30s, within 3 to 5 years of the resurrection of Jesus. But when we look at 1 Thessalonians or other books in the New Testament, the songs in the New Testament are very important. Philippians chapter 2, Colossians chapter 1. These are passages that predate the letters. So in other words, Paul is quoting earlier material still. And that earliest material has to get us back into the 30s. It must be within a few years of the time of the resurrection. Now that's the literary evidence. And again, Emily, you're going to add to this, but let me just throw one other thing out as well. Also remember, this is an oral culture where they learn off by heart and repeat things. That's why Jesus repeated things. We do get repetitions of teaching. They repeat and repeat because you learn orally. You're not carrying these scrolls around with you, or codexes as they'd later become. You're carrying it around your memory. Our modern memories are very poor. We know that with our use of the internet. We know our long-term memory is getting poorer and poorer because we know how to Google it. The ancients didn't have Google, but they did use their brain well. And an oral tradition has great memory. And they could remember what Jesus said very, very well. Young Jewish children still today will learn long, long texts of the Old Testament off by heart. Their memories are still that good. Well, we may have lost that, but in the early church, this is the period of oral tradition and good memory.
Chris, thank you. Looking at the time, we've not got loads more time. I am going to, there's a number of questions that hit on a similar theme that I'm going to come back to at the end. I want to ask you a couple of things before that, but just give you a notion of the impact. Is it really that essential that we really, believe this and act upon it? We'll come to that in a minute. But Chris, just a couple of questions. Similar vein. In terms of evidence that sits outside the Bible, is there any at all? If there is, does it corroborate, does it support, does it contradict for the resurrection?
Well, the evidence, there's extra biblical evidence for Jesus, and that's the important thing here. So we have the Roman historians Pliny and Tacitus. We're talking in the early 100s there, who are referring to Jesus or to Christus, which is a miswritten Latin name for Christ, Christus. We have Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, and he's probably the most important one here, and that would be in the 90s, who's making reference to Jesus. Sorry, the time's passing by, but I just want to make this point. Josephus makes two references to Jesus. One is in Book 18 of the Antiquities of the Jews, one is in Book 20. I've lost some of you, haven't I? He makes two references to Jesus. One of the references is probably not authentic in Book 18. It's probably been tampered with. It may well be a reference to Jesus, but the form we have it in is probably not authentically Josephus. That's fine. Book 20 has another reference to Jesus, and that is authentic. That's commonly agreed as an authentic reference to Jesus. And it's particularly important because it's a reference actually to Jesus only because it's a reference to James, and James is significant. So Jesus was referred to there as the brother of James, as Josephus refers to him. So you've got this extra biblical material for the impact both of Jesus as a historical figure, and inevitably that's only because of the resurrection. The point is really, in terms of extra biblical evidence, we would not be talking about Jesus tonight if he'd not risen from the dead. There were lots of other claimed messiahs and miracle workers in the ancient world. From the period just before Jesus and just after Jesus, those kind of claims went around. But we're still talking about Jesus 2,000 years on. And the only explanation for that continuing significance of Jesus is that he truly did rise from the dead. And that would be part of the extra biblical evidence.
Thank you, Chris. So to the two of you, we've had a number, and I have to say, because of time, this is going to be the last one now. Thank you. I've got loads. It's buzzing away here. It's good to hear that so many of you are asking these questions. Do catch any one of us afterwards and put them to us individually. Apologies if you've sent yours in. One or two of you have sent more than one, I've noticed, and we've not been able to come to some of those, so sorry about that. But this really is about the impact. The reference in this particular message is were the stakes really that high? In the Bible, Jesus never said that he wanted to create a religion, but rather open people's eyes to our God. Could the resurrection simply be just the icing on the cake? Is it a sort of almost a thing which you could leave, you could take, because it's not that important. How would you respond to that, John?
I think I would simply go back to something you started with this evening, that you quoted that verse that basically says that if the resurrection didn't happen, our faith is in vain. We are to be pitied of most people. So to me, it is totally central, totally crucial as far as the impact is concerned. And without the resurrection, then my faith means nothing.
Thank you, John. Emily?
I think as well, without the resurrection, you could still say there'd be some maybe benefits to following Jesus' teaching, the things he said, but he would just be a good teacher. He would just be a human whose example we could follow. And that could be great. But the reality of life is that we need more than that, because even at our best, we can't actually follow his example perfectly. We can't love like he loved. And we see that in ourselves, we see it in our broken world. And also, we don't have an answer to the biggest things like death. And so if Jesus was just a good teacher, he comforts us maybe. Maybe he gives us, some kind of spiritual guidelines. But if he rose, then he not only can tell us how to love, but he actually can give us power to love people and the ability to do that. And also, he can guarantee that there is hope beyond death. That it's not just heaven isn't just a nice idea or a dream, but it's actually a reality because he's gone there, and then we get to follow him.
Thank you, Emily. Chris, do you want to just add something to close?
No, I thought that was great. I mean, the only thing that just occurred to me is how, in terms of this impact of Jesus, the impact it's having today, there's no one else that comes close to this, and the resurrection of Jesus is what really changes it. There are great people who've come and gone in history, inspiring people and great leaders, but Jesus Christ rise from the dead is right at the heart of our good news, because it's the Jesus who's here tonight, the Jesus who got you here tonight, the Jesus who has thrown things your way that have made you, perhaps led you to be thinking about the resurrection this evening. He is a risen Saviour.
Thank you all. We'll show our appreciation in just a moment. We've come to the end of our time. I think we've just got just a few minutes at the back for refreshments and the book table. Do apologise that we're going to need to usher one another out fairly swiftly when it approaches 8:30, because we only have this building until that time. But I just want to close by reading two things to you. One, a text that I received this morning, and the other something from God's Word, the Bible. Just thinking on that about the significance of all we've been hearing this evening. In addition to hearing about those attacks today in Sri Lanka, you may also have heard of the tragic death of a young couple on holiday, both school teachers, this last holiday. And I got this from a friend, a pastor in London. Many of you will know the tragic loss this week of Toby and Millie Saville, who were members of Globe Church before joining the launch team in September of a Hope Church, Vauxhall. Like those disciples on the Emmaus Road, our hearts are heavy with grief at the loss of such a wonderful couple who loved the Lord with a passion and served him so faithfully, not only in their 21 months of marriage, but many years beforehand. tomorrow, this was written yesterday, Globe and Hope churches will rejoice and draw immeasurable comfort that Christ is risen, and with him all who die in him. And then he put, so preach it, brother. And I want to finish with the words of Paul to a group of skeptics in the city of Athens, surrounded by idols, those things that people had built to give their lives to. And he said this, therefore we're God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Now there were different responses to Jesus then, and there will be today. But if you've become compelled by this truth that Jesus rose and is alive this evening, then I want to urge you to do something about it, talk to someone. We've got information that we can give to you. We'd love to talk to you in person. I've let this run on a bit. I notice it's nearly 8 o'clock, and I have said to the team doing refreshments that we will draw a line and not have refreshments this evening. I know it's hot and everything else, we'll all have a drink, but it's really important that we have time to clear everything away, so we won't have refreshments this evening. But do make the most of this opportunity. If God is prompting you and tugging on your heart, don't leave it, don't put it off. Speak to someone this evening and speak to him. I think we want to say thank you to these three. It's been great, hasn't it? Safe journey home and good night. Thank you.